Welcome to the Hindu's Parley podcast. I'm your host, Arun Deep. As we record this on Wednesday, February 5th, Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, is in India and he has a packed schedule. Such a packed schedule, in fact, that he had an on-stage chat with IT Minister Ashwini Vaishnav, and that conversation was only around 15 minutes long. But even during those 15 minutes, he had to address something that he said last time he visited.
Truly substantial.
Look, the way this works is we're going to tell you it's totally hopeless to compete with us on training foundation models. You shouldn't try, and it's your job to try anyway.
A foundational AI model is a machine learning model that uses a huge amount of data, and that's essentially what powers services like ChatGPT and Google's Gemini. Training a foundational model is a really expensive thing to do, and that's why Nandan Nilekani, one of the founders of Infosys, said last December that it was essentially not the best use of a company's money, right? That it was a waste of resources. But a couple weeks ago, the Chinese firm DeepSeek surprised the world by training a foundational model at a fraction of the cost that the likes of OpenAI had been spending. And that has pulled us back into this debate on a foundational model. Should we be building one? Sam Altman today said, well, even with DeepSeek, it's still a really expensive thing to do to train a foundational model, but there are other kinds of small language models or SLMs and reasoning models that India can still have a leadership position in. Now, some Indian firms have been actively trying to train our own foundational model, and they have a couple arguments. One being that we need a domestic solution for local needs, and the other is about having sovereignty over the model, right? So that Indian AI deployments aren't at the mercy of the big global companies that are leading the cutting edge work being done there. So, to take stock of where we are headed on foundational models and AI deployment, we have Pranesh Prakash, who works on law, public policy, and technology. He's a co founder at the Center for Internet and Society and is also right now the principal consultant at Anekanta, a law and policy advisory. Pranesh is also an affiliated fellow at the Yale Law School's Information Society project. And we have Tanuj Bhojwani, who was most recently the head of People Plus AI, and he's also been a part of iSPIRT, which has worked on a lot of the digital public infrastructure, the DPI projects like Aadhaar and UPI, which is called the IndiaStack. So Pranesh, let's start with you. Does India need to build a foundational model for these reasons? For these reasons of, okay, we have local needs, and also for this more kind of nebulous concept of let's have sovereignty over these models.
Hi. I believe that India should be working on foundation models, but not from the for the purpose of sovereignty. It needs to be working on these because it's important to have people who are able to build foundation models, and it's just as it's important to have people who are able to build on top of foundation models to repurpose those models in order to deploy those models and build applications which use those models. We need to have people in India who are able to be able to apply themselves to every part of building AI, as we are calling them these days. But that's not from the perspective of sovereignty, and let me explain why. Sovereignty is something that we should be concerned about if uh, w- from the perspective of things like sanctions, which we've seen even the US apply sanctions over specific kinds of chips, especially those that are used for in the training of AI models. Export controls over things like software, even or models, even those may be coming down the road. But here's why I don't think you need to be worried about that as things stand. Uh, that is because right now, what we have are not just proprietary models, by which I mean models which are closed, which are under license, which can't legally be used without the permission of the person who created that model. What we have are also a lot of open weights models and a few open source models. And those, and DeepSeek 1 DeepSeek's R1, which got released recently, that is an open weights model. And because we have these open weights model for which you don't need permission, which you can deploy locally, which you can adapt to your own needs and so on, because those are available, we don't need to be approaching these from a model from the perspective of national security and sovereignty and being concerned about sanctions and so on. Say there are sanctions tomorrow which are applied to the usage of any models produced in the US. Now, Indians can just fork the code of many of the existing open source models and use those and refashion those and build on top of those. So as long as these models exist and are state of the art and are competing well against proprietary models, and I believe we'll soon come to a point where they'll outcompete proprietary models. They'll be even better than proprietary models. Uh, as long as that is the world we live in, we don't need to be concerned about this from the perspective of sovereignty. We should be approaching it from a perspective of knowledge and from the perspective of openness. We want to be promoting openness, want to be making it easier for Indian developers to deploy and to develop on top of models and to make sure that they are work well in Indian conditions, in Indian languages, and so on.
Thank you, Pranesh. Tanuj, uh, same question, right? What do we, I mean, do we need a foundational model for these reasons of kind of sovereignty and uh, kind of being able to adapt to local conditions, or can we just get away with forking what's already out there?
No, I think one is you can say, oh, for the reason of sovereignty, we should do this. But I will go a step further and say, like what Pranesh pointed to, is that if they really wanted to block you, they would start with chips, right? They would start with, even if you had your own model, you need GPUs to run it on. Sovereignty will start there. If then export controls, are put on high-end GPUs or any GPUs for us, the next question would be, like at least DeepSeek also started using the new Huawei chips, 910Cs, and a lot of their inferencing load is working on that. India can't even put that up, right? We have no ability and no contract with any manufacturer of ours, with TSMC or anyone, to produce chips even of a previous generation. We can stop this. So sovereignty is really not what is driving this conversation. I do believe there's an element of pride here, right? I think we are ambitious people and we want to have our own model and lay claim. And we've done this in other areas. We've reached beyond, what, as per GDP per capita, etc., our OCAD would be. I think that word just the best justice to what we're trying to do here. Having said that, what Nandan's point, what I think my point also is that, just do this if you see returns, right? Like do this if anybody who sees the returns on it, whether if that pride is your return, is why you're doing it, then the investment proportional to getting that pride or getting that result is what we're talking about. And the fact of the matter is that even with DeepSeek, even with those reduction in costs, it still remains a game of a few $100 million. DeepSeek V3 said that that particular training run, which finally led to the final weights, was $5.6 million. But you can imagine that in cutting edge research, state of the art stuff like this, there is going to be a lot of attempts on goal before you get to that perfect 5.6 billion pass. So we're still talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of investments. And even if you produce a foundation model, some company in India produces a foundational model, there's still going to be a lot for them to do and work on and pay salaries and so much other things going on before you can make money back out of that. And here's the truth about that: the market is still majority the US. About 60% of the market cap of the entire globe, if you take all private companies, all stock markets, about 60% of that is still the US. Even today, B2B SaaS founders in India are largely selling to the US. Global companies out of China, Japan, anywhere, like car manufacturers, also look at the US as an important market because that's where the purchasing power is. If we believe we'll make a local model with Indian language, sort of, specialties and then sell to Indian companies, and that's where we do it. I still think that you're kind of capping yourself in the knee there again, because the overall Indian enterprise market, which will purchase AI, is much smaller. Remember, we will not fall for the an O1 Pro at a $200 replacing $200 a month, replacing an entire, someone doing a job is viable in the US. In India, that is the salary you're paying to somebody, maybe not exactly $200, but something close enough that the error and the tolerance for replacing a person does not, hold good. The other competitor in this space, as we often tend to do with these programs or these large missions, is we ask the government to step in and do this. I think India creating a foundational model, India being now in this case, I'm talking about not Indians, but India government. I think that also is very hard for very good reasons. We've set up a governance mechanism, procurement rules, all of that. Some of them are a little too red tapey. It's very hard to break through them. So for the government to do this, they need to set up a special institute, give it special powers, let it spend its own money. 95% of that money will go to failed experiments. The current bureaucracy, the regular ministry, how they procure, how we do contracts, are not designed for something that where 95% of the money goes to something where you have nothing to show for. I think the real question to ask is not should we do the Herculean effort of building one foundational model, but to ask what are the investments we should be making such that the environment, the research environment, the innovation, the sort of private market investors, etc., all come together and orchestrate in a way to produce somewhere out of a lab or out of a private player a foundational LLM models. I think the real questions that we're not paying attention to is why does it not happen? What is wrong with our research culture? What is wrong with our R&D investment spend, both by private market and government, right? And those are the questions to answer. Why do we not have the conditions for a foundational model or an LLM to have emerged, rather than should we do a foundation model?
Great. Thanks, Tanuj. And Pranesh, this is a question on essentially what Tanuj just said, right? Which is that what is the state of AI research and education in India right now, in terms of where we are at for readiness, in terms of achieving not just a foundational model, but all the downstream cases that you had kind of cited, right? What's your take on where things are at and what needs to change?
I think there's a lot that we can still work on in India, but that's neither here nor there. Just as I believe there's a lot we can do, even in terms of software, which India has been seen as a success. I think there's still a lot more we can be doing in terms of improving quality of education. Uh, Let me just point out first that uh, even though we have just looking at large language models as an area, even though we have a number, more than a dozen models coming out of India, only two, I believe, are those that have been built ground up in India, which are Sarvam 2B and IndiaBART. The rest have been built on top of existing open weight models, such as Meta's Llama group of models. And so we need not just the knowledge to make foundation models, but also uh, how to build on top of them, how to retrain them, how to fine tune them, and very importantly, and this is a point that a professor at Princeton, Arvind Narayanan, has been making repeatedly, that right now, in terms of AI, where we're especially lacking is in terms of applications. We have models that don't necessarily work very well, uh, but are much, much better than what we need for a wide variety of applications. And where we're actually lacking is in terms of turning those models into actual commercial applications that are being deployed and used and tested well, and so on. That's something that India should focus on as well. So it's not just a question about foundation models, but through the entire pipeline, we need training, we need education. Now, I recently, a few months ago, was at a conference where there were very young developers who were calling themselves AI developers, and a large number of them were very kicked about it. But um, I must admit that what they knew about even the basics of uh, of locally using AI models, that there are different kinds of AI models, some which are better suited for certain kinds of tasks, others which are instruct models which are suited for other kinds of tasks, and so on, depending on your use case. They didn't know that. And I, someone who doesn't come from the software field, I know that. So I still think there are a lot of low hanging fruits to be picked, but the enthusiasm is definitely there. I know that students nowadays in their first year are learning to deploy and use basic kinds of developmental tools like PyTorch and so on, as part of their courses right from the very beginning in the first year in many cases. And so I think things are looking promising on that front, but I still think in terms of the cutting edge, we have a fair amount of work to do. And let me also point out that resource constraints in the form of limited access to high end GPUs can also spur innovation. And I think DeepSeek and Alibaba, and other Chinese companies definitely show that that is the case, that you can achieve a lot uh, on very little in terms of GPU. And um, of course, they had access to many of the highest end GPUs, but not as many as their counterparts in places like the West. And so we shouldn't forget that Jugad, the innovation imposed by constraints, is also something that we should be promoting.
Got it. Thanks, Pranesh. Now, Tanuj, right, a week ago, the IT Minister Ashwini Vaishnaw, he announced a GPU cluster that would be made available to startups, academia, and so on, whoever wanted to run compute for heavily subsidized rates, right? We're talking something that's less than half of what it costs in the US, for instance. So uh, that's one kind of initiative, right? They're also talking about things like creating a datasets platform so that you have more local language content that is ingested and fed into these platforms, into these models, right? So what's your take on these kinds of initiatives when it comes to promoting AI research, and what would you count as like success, right? Maybe not in the distant future, but in the next couple years or so.
So look, I think as far as I understand, unless something has changed, they've not made these details very clear. The RFE that was issued for the GPUs was that the government will get a bulk rate by requesting an RFP, and a lot of people came in and bid, and they bid certain prices. On top of that, the government will give a 50% subsidy, which is that they will pay for half the GPU, and you have to pay for half the GPU. This does bring down the cost of renting a GPU significantly downwards. But even then, somewhere in all of this are the margins that we are paying to data center operators, providers, etc., to do these things. It is my understanding that both DeepSeek and, of course, all the large labs definitely have dedicated contracts wherein they're buying, installing the GPUs, and using them, completely by themselves for training runs. And when they're not using them, they're being used for inferencing, especially since we're in an inference test time scaling paradigm right now, right? So scaling inferencing is becoming important for models like O1, R1, etc. I slightly disagree with Pranesh that, of course, DeepSeek had fewer models, and the more number of engineers had to share those resources, but they still had more than a critical threshold. We know for a fact they have at least one 10,000 H100 cluster. They have a few, like another 10,000 E100 clusters or whatever. There's a calculation going around the internet, which is an estimate. Nobody can be sure, but the estimate is $1.3 billion of hardware spent by DeepSeek, right? So when we say that yes, it can be done, even in like OpenAI was wasting compute, like they weren't trying to optimize it. DeepSeek went a step further and did a bunch of optimizations. But let's just start by acknowledging that the people who are putting out these models are all operating with somewhere in the realm of about 10,000 dedicated GPU clusters, at least at the bare minimum. I mean, we know the big labs, Meta, etc., have more than 50,000. They've placed an order of 50,000. They're investing $80 billion or so, round about all of them, about $50 to $80 billion a year on infrastructure build out. Microsoft has said this. Meta has sort of maybe not that high a number, but they've definitely put in. I think they own about 100, somewhere between 100 and 200,000 GPUs, etc. So compared to that, the Indian government is renting or has the capacity to rent some 16,000 GPUs. So this is just to put the numbers in perspective, right? What we're talking about, what the gap is. And plus, remember, these are all individual labs, well coordinated, that have clear distinctions. Okay, there's only one Llama project inside Meta, right? There aren't five, there aren't three. So that 50, whatever, 100,000 GPUs are being therefore divided amongst their own projects and their priority, but in a focused kind of manner. The other thing I worry about is that the government really hasn't put out a plan. They may have some thoughts, again, I do not know, but they haven't put out a plan on how they're going to split up these 16,000 GPUs that are subsidized, not owned. And but people will still have to pay for the privilege of doing it. And I still think that even with this, even with, let's say, a overall 30 to 40% price of what is in the open market, are we still, in orders of magnitude, both in the amount of GPUs we are going to provide to whichever labs, um, and the sort of spend that this lab will have to, pay upfront. They're not getting it for free. Remember, they will still have to pay a cost, maybe only 30% or 40% of what they would have had to pay in the open market, but still, they have to pay. And the second thing is in terms of, like I said, the total volume of chips, right? Like you see, like whatever is the Llama 4 training budget, um, we have less than that, and we have to divide that amongst the whole country fairly, right? The government is not taking that concentrated bet. We are taking very sparse resources that we have, and we are further thinning it out between a lot of labs. So I am not sure, right, if we, in the state of resources, can actually get to that foundation model aspiration. This is still a very good number. Don't get me wrong, right? It is still, the subsidy and what they're providing is still very good. And if people are using it for the right things, like AI for Bharat is trying to train Indic Trans 2 and maybe a TTS on Indian languages, and those are critical things we need. And you can get away with, say, 500 or 1,000 GPUs on that task, and you don't get very good results compared to the state of the art for Indian languages. So I think that's really the message, right? We should acknowledge that we have limited resources, and then we should think about what is the wisest way to spend them. Competing with an O3, R1, and DeepSeek may not be the best idea with the absolute quantum of resources we're talking about.
Thanks, Tanuj. Pranesh, can you talk about what the wisest way to kind of have governments play a role in this build out of AI should be, and whether what we saw last week with the minister's announcements, whether that is a good start on going about this?
I think it is a good start with all the caveats and explanations that Tanuj added. What I would add is, apart from just um, looking at the models and training and so on, and a lot of this does seem to be focused on foundation models, quite unfortunately, with the tagline sovereign models, which even companies are promoting. Companies like Nvidia go around talking about sovereign models because they want to sell more chips. So, but rather than falling within that trap, I think um, government should look at other ways of promoting responsible usage of these technologies, including amongst them doing careful studies of what kinds of regulations ought to be put, and very importantly, what kinds of regulations ought not to be put.
Thank you, Pranesh, and thank you, Tanuj. This has been the Hindu's Parley podcast on AI foundational models for India.